Hello and welcome to Teaching Python. This is episode 135, and today we're going to be talking about Python for law students. My name's Sean Tiber. I'm a coder who teaches.
And my name's Kelly Schuster Paredes, and I'm a teacher who codes.
This week we're joined by Morgan Gray and Wes Oliver, both from the Duquesne University School of Law. Welcome, Wes. Welcome, Morgan. It's great to have you on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So we met Wes and Morgan at PyCon during the Education Summit. They presented on their efforts to teach more law students about computer science and coding and Python as a way to engender a lot of different benefits for their students as they pursue the law and the study of it. So we wanted to dig into that more and bring what they're doing to a little bit larger audience around the world. So thank you for joining us, and looking forward to getting into the conversation a little bit later. All right.
Absolutely.
So let's start where we normally do with the wins of the week. Kelly, would you like to pick our first contestant this week?
I'm going to have to pick Morgan because, I talked to Morgan more at PyCon, I think, than Wes. And I think he's just like ready to go. He looks beaming with a win of the week. So tag, you're it.
Well, let's think. There are just so many.
You bought a house.
Yeah, I just bought a house.
Wow.
Oh, congratulations.
That's a good win.
I think maybe the Python win of the week is I just started really putting together the materials for a class that I'm going to teach in the fall. That's an extension of coding for lawyers, and it's natural language lawyering. And that's where I'm going to take law students through what's going on in natural language processing, where that's going in the legal field, how it impacts them. And my hope is that by the time they walk out of there, they will be at least comfortable, understanding at a moderately detailed level how an LLM works.
Nice.
That's really cool. I feel like you should test it out on me, and then I can just learn, on the side, sort of like a university student, but for free.
All right. Well, Wes, over to you. How about a win of the week?
Sure. Well, I spoke on Friday at CaliCon in Seattle, and you always kind of come away from those kind of things with a little bit of some tidbit of some sort. And I learned about PyQt, which I'm just now starting to get into. Truly, I've opened the file, I opened it up, I've looked at it, and I think it's going to be very useful for teaching students how to build graphical user interfaces. And that's actually been the thing that we have not focused on, because neither of us, we're very new to this. Morgan's just finished all the coursework for his PhD, so he's done a whole bunch of work. But we've both been coding now, 4 or 5 years, no more than that. And so there's a lot we haven't seen and done. And graphics is something that we haven't focused on at all. I taught a class on R for a statistics and machine learning class, and we did a lot of graphics there. And what I found in teaching is that when you can make things pretty, and you can get students to make things that are pretty, then they become attached to the process. So I'm very excited about what I might be able to figure out with PyQt for helping students learn how to build graphical user interfaces.
So I know I'm supposed to go on to the wins of the week, but that's one of the things, when you guys were presenting at PyCon, I was like, these guys are like us. Everything he's talking about. So we'll talk more about that, about your win. That's awesome. Sean, are you going to do your win?
Sure. So my win was something kind of that didn't work out that well, but it was pretty amazing that I got it as far as I did. So my in-laws were cleaning out a closet in their house, and we discovered boxes of old cassette tapes, and a lot of them are recordings of classical music and things on the radio. And I found a copy of the Hanukkah song that I guess my wife recorded at one point from Adam Sandler. But we found some recordings in Hebrew from overseas relatives that were sent over on tape, just prior to the ability to, have long international phone calls, prior to the internet and all of these things. So I was telling Kelly before the show, we found a really old recording, and I don't understand any of it. It's all in Hebrew. So My job though was to hook up the deck to the audio input on my laptop and digitize everything. And so I was able to get a decent digital copy of it, clean up some of the noise, things like that. But then I was like, I wonder if I could transcribe this. Like I've only looked for English transcription, but I'm sure that there's a way to transcribe this from Hebrew. And so I did, and I used like Assembly AI. I uploaded it, and 2 minutes later, I had a bunch of Hebrew that I still can't read. Um, but then I could put that into a translation model and translate it into English. And of course, as you can imagine, by the time you go through several rounds of taking a really old audio tape, cleaning it up, trying to transcribe it, it's very conversational and slangy, not necessarily formal speech, and then translate that from Hebrew into English. It was basically just unintelligible by the end. But I still thought about how cool it was that we could do this, like that this whole chain of going from I found a tape in a closet to here's a translation in English on it. We're probably getting to a point where maybe that whole chain isn't great right now, but we're maybe a year or two away, or just I need to find a better model to get it to something that actually would be useful. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That is pretty
Yeah,
cool.
That's really cool.
Very, very typical of Sean. He's like, "Oh, I'm just gonna do this," and starts doing stuff. Well, mine's kind of cool, but not so accomplished like most of my projects lately. But I started building, like when I was taking my data science course, I started playing around with Flask, and I was trying to build an app just to see if it functions, and playing around with the activities. And then after speaking with Jay, I was like, I wonder if I can do this in Django. I absolutely have zero knowledge of Django, so I put it all into ChatGPT, and didn't know that pretty much Django has everything built out for you, and it has a SQLite thing already in there, and authentication for like sign in and cybersecurity. And within less than 2 days this week, not even a full 2 days, I have a working app that loads data from a form into SQLite. And then I'm trying to mess around with the HTML with ChatGPT. I'm trying to do this completely with ChatGPT and see how far I can go. But my web page is very grayed out, so I'm trying to find out what I did and put a mask on it somewhere. But it was cool just to see, and now I'm trying to figure out actually if I can learn Django, because it's pretty intense with all of the packaging that it makes. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it makes like a my package, like my app, and then the main app, and you have all these files. It might just be a chat GPT thing, but it was pretty fun. So that was a huge learning win.
I will say, Kelly, when I want to do like rapid development, if there's a project that I need done and I need to get it done quick, it's like my editor in one screen and GPT-4 in the other, shamefully.
Yeah.
And so whenever I know that I come up across something, maybe it'll take me 10 minutes to think through, I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to be lazy this time.
Well, that's what we're teaching. That's what we're teaching the 8th graders. Like, we show them Matplotlib, and then I said, okay, go for it. Here's the other libraries that make cool graphs. Here's the other libraries where you can do this. And I had a kid, I was on a podcast last weekend. I was saying this one kid didn't do any of his homework at all, but then he came to me and said, my grade's really crummy. Can I get a boost? Here's what I've been learning. And he shows me how he was taking about, I don't know, 800,000 lines of data about horse racing. And he was plugging it in and learning TensorFlow and machine learning with ChatGPT. And I said, okay, can you write a summary about that? And I had shown him a couple of things, and I showed him Anaconda's data science, whatever. And he comes up to me and asks me this math formula. I was like, you don't have to know that math. It's just know if it's 1 or -1, and it's the model's good or not. I don't know what's going on with that math problem.
Wow.
But it's crazy. But anyways, I digress.
Well, I think it's interesting. I like you said, shamefully having GPT-4 there. I don't think there's any shame in that at all, Wes. Like, and Morgan, I think it's, I think if you showed someone from 1985, one of our modern coding editors where it does auto-completes and linting, and you hover over it and it tells you exactly what the problem, they'd be like, that's cheating, right? I think we're going to be very close to a point where a few years from now, like, it's going to be so commonplace that nobody even thinks about it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's invaluable. Like, if you're just having a bad day and you're just tired and you know you could figure it out otherwise, but you just really need to get through. I mean, it's sped me along many, many, many times.
Yeah, they're
For sure.
great. Yeah, I was gonna say it's also great when you're given a little pop quiz and you generate some code, and then you say, "No, make it basic. No, don't use functions. No, don't do this." And then you give it to the kids, and you're just like, "Okay, I can prove to you that you've learned Python with me. Read this code," and they're like, "Oh yeah." So it's a great little tool for that.
Absolutely.
Well, why don't we jump into the main topic of discussion and start talking about Python for lawyers and proto lawyers, people who are studying for law. Why don't we start, Wes and Morgan? Could you introduce yourselves? Talk a little bit about kind of where you work now, what you're interested in, and how you came to
Yeah.
be teaching Python.
Yeah. So I had no background in this. As a kid, I was really fascinated by computers, and we didn't get one in my family, and it really wasn't taught in school. We had like a basic class. I remember in 11th grade, but like there was no real in-depth sense of like using math and computers. Although I always remembered my 11th grade teacher talking about how computer programs were using some of the things that we were talking about, and I was fascinated by in math class in the 11th grade. But like our computer programming classes in high school were in basic and that was a great description of what we were doing. So I never really got into them, and I was a history major in college and went to law school, and I always kind of wanted to find my way back to math because I always found math just fascinating. But I never really knew how this would happen, and so every year I would teach Crim Pro, and there's a legal standard called probable cause and a lesser one called reasonable suspicion. Probable cause allows a search or an arrest, and reasonable suspicion allows someone to be detained while the officer conducts some kind of an investigation. And I would teach these standards every year, and I would tell my students, look, I can't tell you what satisfies it because I can only show you cases where it has been satisfied and has not been satisfied. And a court can consider absolutely anything. So anytime you change any one fact, it's up for grabs what a court's going to do. And I'm teaching you how to argue. I'm not teaching you how to arrive at an answer. And that was a terribly unsatisfying answer, although much of the law is kind of undetermined. This one seemed particularly so. And so I set out to try to find an answer to this. I was watching 60 Minutes one night, and they were talking about how AI was being used to read medical journals because no human could read all the medical journals in the world. What if a computer could read them and find connections between medical journals? Maybe research on malaria could help us with research on AIDS in ways that no one would anticipate because no one would think these things would be connected in any way. And I thought, isn't that probable cause? You've got a whole bunch of cases out there. Is it possible for a computer to do this? We started talking to computer scientists about solving the problem. They said it was doable. They started playing around a little bit with it. And Morgan was my research assistant. We both started working on this. We both became unsatisfied, not knowing what they were talking about. And we decided we need to learn it for ourselves. One thing led to another. He starts getting his PhD, and we realized other lawyers could benefit from what we know. And Python for Lawyers was born at Duquesne.
There's so many thoughts on that. You want to go first, Sean?
Well, and Morgan, how was this just something like Wes came to you one day and was like, "Hey, I'm thinking about this," and you're like, "Let's do this. Let's get into it." Did you have a background or interest?
Actually, that's a fun story. Okay, I'm thrilled anytime we get to tell it. Our relationship begun because I told him I didn't like how he taught, and as an excellent person as he is, he took it in stride and asked me why, which started the conversation about computers, computer science, and I had admitted that I was like I'd taken like one class on it in college, and it was this like an upper level statistics class, and I had to use some sort of statistical software. I don't even know if you'd call it a programming language or something like that. But I had been interested, and I remembered really looking back on it fondly. And so that's how what looks from my perspective on how we got onto it. And I will say it was really truly driven by we were just tired of not knowing. you know, we were, it was really hard to tell whether, and not that anybody who we were working with was nefarious at all. They were extremely helpful. But you need to know these things. You need to understand what's going on. What do you mean when you say this? You know, and I think for both of us, it was just we were getting unsatisfying answers a lot of the time, and we wanted to be able to do it ourselves. And I think too, like one of the things that I did want to mention is at heart we're like both tinkerers. You know, we get into something and start tinkering with it and playing with it and toying with it and figuring it out, and that sort of really kept it going. As you know, with programming, there's literally always something to tinker with, and I think we find a lot of our students are that way too.
Yeah, and some of them aren't, and that's actually kind of fascinating. I've kind of stopped advertising for the class because I really encouraged a whole bunch of people to take it. And the first year that was great, and a lot of them whittled down after the first week, and we were left with a lot of great people. The second year, I encouraged a lot of people to take it, and there was no whittling. And I think there was a certain amount of discontent in the people who were taking it. Almost like if you know the story of, you mentioned your Hebrew text, the story of Gideon's army, how they let the guy go, and they feared he was drinking the water a certain way, and they said send everybody else home. I kind of feel like that our programming classes are kind of like that. I've stopped advertising for them and stopped kind of really encouraging people to take it, because I think the people who find their way to us, we certainly don't hide what we're doing, but the people who aren't sort of like, you know, the first time we went around to all the classes and said, look, you really need to know this for your future. I absolutely believe that's true. I think if you don't know this stuff in 5 years, you're not going to have a job. I might be exaggerating a bit, but not much. But I also think that the dynamic of the room is so much better when you have people who are excited about it. And so I also think the dynamic of the room gets spoiled a little bit when you have people who have a constant frustration who are not tinkerers. So I've been a little lighter in the way that I've gone about trying to recruit students. And I think that's created a smaller and more committed core.
There's so many things. Like I was saying earlier in the start of the show, there's so many things when you guys are talking that I'm just like, yes, that's me. Yes, that's me. It's, you know, I teach middle school computer science. They're forced to take it. They don't want to be there. So, you know, we have about 5 people at the beginning who are just in it. They've been coding in Scratch. These are little 6th graders. And it's this, how do I get them to understand and love it and feel the passion that I feel as a non-computer science person? And it's all these things that you were talking about that for you guys getting into it, that kind of just-in-time learning, things that Sean and I say all the time, like you have a project, that's why Python comes across, or that's why we need to learn how to code, or this real world application. So I'm particularly interested in that aspect of getting into the Python, and I fully believe less than 5 years, when you start talking to those law students, it's gonna be less than 5 years if they don't have some sort of computer science. But I want to kind of go back to that whole approach to integrating the Python into your law curriculum. You guys are non-computer science majors, so Morgan, you've had like the experience of computer science teachers now at a doctorate level, right? So you understand they go.
I went past Go maybe twice, maybe
Okay.
4 times, and then like wound myself up to graduate level. CS is where I started. For anybody out there, I would not recommend coming in on the top floor if you can avoid it. I couldn't avoid it.
So you know, like how a computer science kind of
exactly how they go. Yeah,
how they go. So how does this differ? So this is like a big thing and I think it's best that you describe it in your terms. How does it differ from traditional computer science courses? And I'll let you explain, because I know how I differ.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I can put this eloquently, maybe even colloquially in a funny manner. In coding for lawyers, you're sort of met with a loving embrace, and you just don't get that in computer science class. You know, it's very cold, and you know, I hate to use this word, but it's cold, sciencey. You know, if it's not precise, then it might not be anything at all. You know, sort of kind of just throw that out the window. Not very welcoming. And we sort of like our first go into this is we like turn that on its head entirely. We want you to be there. We're glad that you're there. We're absolutely welcoming to the nth degree. We also, the one thing that we say is like, we do understand this because we've been where you've been before, and we remember what it's
like a year ago.
Yeah, like
right.
actually not that long ago.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, those years are adding up. They're ticking
No,
up now.
That's true.
But we like show like we have been here before. We know that this doesn't feel nice all of the time,
but it feels great some of the time.
Yeah. It does feel great some of the time, but especially when you're starting, it just doesn't feel nice. It's like learning it's truly like learning a different language. I think I made the remark at PyCon, it'd be no different if I started, spewing German or something to you from the lectern. You're not gonna get it if you don't know it already. And so we take the traditional sort of CS attitude towards things and throw that right out the window. And we want it to be as welcoming and inclusive as possible. And we go to, in terms of, I don't want to say extreme as in it's bad, but in terms of what you would get from a standard course, we do go to extremes. Extended office hours. We're available combined like 20 hours a week or something like that, for the coding students.
Actually, I was 20 hours on my own.
Yeah.
And in my office, we've got this giant monitor, so they can come in with a laptop and plug it in. I've got a keyboard that we've got a key that we plug into their computer, so I can type along with them. And a group can sit around at the giant monitor, and we just try to create a space where it's very comfortable for people to do this.
Yeah, and we say, if a student does bad in the class, it's probably because you just didn't come see us. I mean, and that's saying, being like, if you were confused on something, I guarantee we were always there to take your question, work through it with you. I've had students who have, if anybody's taught, you've seen this, an hour before the project's due, a panicked email. And I literally have got on Zoom on Saturday night at 9:00 and worked through something with them. And we just know that they're not coming from a CS background, and knowing that this is hard to get into, like that never leaves the front of our mind. And so treating somebody in that situation, like they are, and being able to respond to that.
And one of the questions I think we had to answer when we proposed doing this is, since this is essentially an undergraduate class in Python, or from what you're saying, an 8th grade class in Python, why are you teaching it in a law school? Why not just have them walk across campus and teach it there? And the answer we gave to that is, there are all kinds of impediments for people to cross-register. And I do think part of that is if the professor is a computer science professor and not a law professor, if the other students are computer scientists and not, or people who are taking STEM classes and that's what their focus is, I think there's something intimidating about that, where there's something much less intimidating than taking that from me, who learned this stuff entirely online just a couple of years ago. And my background is in history. I sound like a law history guy. Whenever I'm describing, oh, here's your iterating variable, I'll slow down and go, oh, wait a minute, you might not know what an iterating variable is. That's the thing that's going to keep ticking off and increasing one time every time you go through there. And I'll remember to say that in a way that a person who does that for a living for years and only does that might not remember.
I'm going to make an.
Oh. Go ahead, John.
I was going to say, I'm going to make an assumption and tell me how valid you feel this is. Not being a lawyer, but knowing lawyers and having very good friends that are lawyers, and just kind of observing the way they think, the way they approach the world. And this is a sweeping generalization, but my sense, or my perception, is that law is one of the purest forms of information processing, right? It is the practice of being able to take in information, synthesize, arrange, organize, and then present or share. And so you have this idea of being able to take what you've learned, what you know, what you can prove with evidence or gather, and turn that into some sort of other information. It's transforming it from one state to another. To me, that feels a lot like what we do in related fields to computer science, like
Yes.
information systems and data management and information processing, like in the library and everything. How much of the way that you've structured your course makes it more tailored towards the aspects of coding that pertain to information processing and retrieval of information, storing things, explaining things in that way, whether it's consciously or subconsciously? Like, I think of computer science more as the study of computing things, and it sounds like you're teaching more from the perspective of here's how to gather, process, and use information in a way with computer science like tools.
Yeah, that's a. I might quote you on that. That's pretty good. In terms of what lawyers do, so I'll say, well, so I've never thought about it that way, but my assessment would be like after the fourth week of the course, which is like in the fourth week we're just getting into iteration, and so by the time I think you've seen basic syntax, variables, conditionals, by the time we're getting to the fourth week where we're starting information iteration, that's when I would say we inject data into the process, and that's what they're doing. I mean, our homework assignments, the in-class assignments are, we've given you some blob of something, whatever it is, whether it's Kentucky Derby data or something having to do with like sifting through legal opinions to find a particular citation, something like that. It's very much like take that, use your programming knowledge and then output something useful with it. And I think, Sean, that's definitely a fair comparison. A lawyer writing a brief or an argument or something like that certainly would have an entire record, an entire 200 years plus of law in front of them. And, you got to take that and boil it down into a little package that somebody can do something with.
And the conference I just spoke at, David Colarusso from Suffolk, who teaches computer science-ish stuff to lawyers there. He said there was a lawyer, a famous lawyer, who tried to square the circle. And what is squaring the circle? You take a circle and you try to create a square that has exactly the same area. And like we all know that's actually mathematically and theoretically pretty easy to do, but how do you actually make it with just like a ruler and a straight edge, or just a straight edge and a pencil and a protractor? And he goes through and talks about how this was Lincoln. Lincoln was fascinated with this. He spent 2 days actually trying to literally do it. And Lincoln was fascinated with Euclid. If you've seen the movie Lincoln with Daniel Day-Lewis, he quotes Euclid in the telegraph office that one day. And I've often thought, so law students learn and more in the past than the present, but still we trained based on some form of the Socratic method. And I've often thought that lawyers are following the wrong Greek. I feel like we ought to be doing more Euclid than we are Socrates. I think Socrates invites certain forms of analogical reasoning where you kind of trace the analogy on down, and all of a sudden you're doing things in the analogous circumstance that might not actually fit back in the original circumstance. And it's more about trickery. Whereas I feel like, or it can be, and I feel like Euclid, if we actually did what Lincoln did and studied more about logical mathematical proof, that very few things in life will fit a mathematical proof. But if that's the gold standard rather than the Socratic method, we might have tighter arguments.
So that is so. I love this. Going back, I want to kind of break that down for me because I like to put it into my head and analyze it. So, as a lawyer, you teach the Python for law, and you're like the fourth week, and I'm thinking this, and also in my lower levels, when they have something to apply, when they're able to use that critical thinking, that method of deduction, that brain power that's connected to their law side, and they're learning Python, they're able to make those connections. Like I can almost foresee medical, here's Python for doctors here. I just feel like we have different levels of understanding, and when we are able to make those connections, those neural synapses, big idea pictures connect, it makes Python become more useful, more personal. So I kind of want to think about shifting a little bit gears. Can you think of someone that was kind of like, oh my gosh, I know you gave us a situation of a girl who hated it at PyCon. You explained her. That was awesome. Can you think of someone also when you saw that other aha moment, like they made a connection, and maybe what helped them connect more with Python and law? Or you can use the same example because I love that story as well.
I'll give you the same example. Yeah, this was great. We had this student who, and she was one of the people who was very frustrated early on. And I told the story earlier about how I've been less sort of PT Barnum like in my effort to get students because I'm one of the smaller, more committed group. I wonder if she would have come in if we hadn't hyped it so much the first year. So if we lose people like her, then that would be really sad. She was a fascinating case. The first week or so, she'd come into office hours or she'd raise her hand in class and be incredibly frustrated. Just like part angry, part upset, kind of a whine. It was just awful. And she finally comes to me like week 4 or 5, and she walks in my office and she's just like mad at me. And I said, let's get back to basics. Why did you sign up for this class at all? She said, I thought it would be fun. I said, then let's get back to trying to make this fun for you. She still left the office mad at me. So then, like, it might have been the next week or so, she raised her hand. Like, we have a period of during the class when they work in groups, and she would always ask really basic questions, and we didn't really think she was following it, and the light bulb just hadn't turned on for her yet. She raised her hand. I'd always kind of like try to ignore her because she was always going to be a time suck, whatever. But I'm like, I've got to go talk to her like I do every week. I went over and looked at it, and she goes, I don't understand why this isn't working. Well, she'd written some crazy complicated thing that had a minor syntax error, like it was missing a comma or something. I said, put a comma there, and not only does this solve the problem, this is a far more elegant solution than we were teaching you. The light bulb had come on. And so at the end of the class, we do object-oriented programming as like one of the last modules. And Morgan said to the class he was teaching that day, and he said, and don't try this at home. We don't want you to do this on your projects because we wanted to introduce it to you so you'd know what it was, but we don't expect anyone to use it in the final project. So she gets this panicked look on her face. Like, what's she worried about now? And she said, well, I'm 3/4 of the way done with the project, and I realized I couldn't solve this without objects because I Googled how to solve this problem. They said I need to do objects. So I went ahead and learned objects on my own. And do I have to take them out? Absolutely not. If you can do that, go for it. And her final project was absolutely brilliant. So yeah, there are these people who have a fear, have a reluctance, and some of them will never get over it. And there are some like her who discovered a whole new world.
But that, okay, sorry. I just
I
want
thought of
to.
another one in the meantime.
Well, I want to go in because this is what is connecting to your Euclid kind of Socrates thing. And I'm thinking, the law students are more ethical and philosophical, and isn't that so more, and you're now trying to twist it on them, right? And say, okay, now we need to like think of reasoning and systems and chronological order. How does that work? I mean, I don't know anything really about the law degree. I'm a bio person. So like, do you think maybe that has a different way, a different
I think they read statutes better.
yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
I'm now taking a class on Java, and when you look at Java programming, it's like if you really want to understand like jurisdiction, well, that's Java. Can you go there? Can you go there? Well, look at what the entry code says. And then if you like look at substructures, like what thing is being triggered, I think that law has fuzzy qualities to it, but there's also just a basic core structure, particularly to a statute. You go here, you go here, you go here, and there'll be fuzzy words there, but you've got to go to the right places.
And I think there's a underlying principle of logic where in law a lot of stuff is conditional. You know, well, if this happens, then we'll do this. If this doesn't happen, we'll do that. You know, even when you file a legal complaint against somebody, you can plead in the alternative, which means if this fails, then we're also, you know, saying this or that or the other thing. It could be any one of these 5 things. We're alleging that. And there's a really good paper. It's more to do with AI, but it talks about how like that's how judges will resolve issues before them, is sort of like a decision tree structure. You know, well, we were presented with this issue and on part of it we found this, and you know, so that means we split the analysis here and we go somewhere else. And so you see that sort of logic popping up all the time in law, and as programmers, you know, that's like what, 75% of it.
Mm-hmm. Funny story. So I'll give you a lesson that you can attempt, because I gave up. With our humanities teacher, I tried to code the Bill of Rights. There's a lot of conditions. There's a lot of conditions in there, and she's teaching me the Bill of Rights. She's like, "Oh, well, that depends." And then, well, you have to consider the ethical, all this stuff. So you see a lot of nested conditionals. So there's a fun little activity. Give them amendment and have them code it.
Yeah, well, exactly. And there's certain, well, and actually that you mentioned this, one of my next projects is I want to develop a tech version of criminal law, because I teach criminal law, where you can opt into this, and I want to teach it, like I want to move criminal law to the second year for folks who do this. So they take coding first year and then take the tech version of crim the second, so that they would actually write a code so that you could give the program they've written a set of facts, and have the code they've written take the exam rather than them. So how do you do this? So, you know, right now people are saying we'll just throw everything into GPT chat. Well, no, because obviously that's going to give you problems. But what you can do is, like with the Bill of Rights, there are certain things that are conditional, right? So like if you're talking about, do you have the right to counsel, for instance? Well, there are certain binary things that are true. If it's a civil case, the answer is absolutely not. If it's a criminal case and you're not going to be sentenced to more than 6 months in jail, no. If there's a possibility of you getting more than 6 months in jail, then yes, you absolutely do have a right to counsel. Now, is that what does it mean to be effective counsel? No, that's very fuzzy. And then, you know, you might send that to some large language model, but you would recognize the answer you get out of that may or may not be correct, but will be a first draft from which you might then start to play around and work. But there are certain aspects to the law that are clear yes, no conditionals, and then there's that you can then improve the performance of large language models by fine-tuning them. But then recognizing those aren't going to necessarily be correct, but there are things that will, you know, most always be correct.
This is why I think that there's so much connection here, and why I was so fascinated, because this is the same sort of thing that I was getting at. My undergraduate degree and graduate degree was all in information systems, right? And yes, there's a ton of computing that needs to happen, but a lot of it is like based on this information that we're processing, what is the right output that we want to have, or what's the structure of this? How do we flow from one state to another? And the more I'm hearing about this, the more I'm seeing all of these connections, because it's not necessarily, you know, who's better at math. It's more about how do you organize your thinking? How do you structure the flow of the information through whatever system you're building? And this leads me to my actual question, which is, you know, kind of, Morgan, you talked about how judges are making decisions using that flow chart in front of them, whether that's explicitly defined or implicit based on their knowledge of the law, and they keep it in their head. And I know that you addressed this question at PyCon, and I wanted to bring it up. Are you seeing students who take your courses being more effective in the other non-coding courses that they take in law school? And, what are the kind of outcomes that you're seeing as a result of this to maybe make them better lawyers?
Yeah, we've gotten great feedback about what it's sort of doing in terms of the law students who they go on from coding and then now they're on to something else, like drafting, or they're in a simulation course where they're drafting documents on behalf of clients. And what we're told is that the coding students are their heads above their peers in terms of the quality of the writing, in terms of how they handle issues. So they're presented with something, it's presented in a clear, clean cut format. Their writing has certainly improved, their way of thinking has improved. And I think, in our class, if you step into coding for lawyers, I mean, every day for the hour and 15 minutes that we're together, it's that sort of, thinking from start to finish. And we're seeing the benefits pour over into other classes, certainly. And we're thankful that other faculty members give us that nice feedback.
It's nice. And I was going to ask, do you think that their analytical skills and everything, critical thinking, that whole
Yeah.
analysis is changing?
Yeah, I actually wanted to remark about that. And that was the story that I thought of while Wes was talking about our one student who had been frustrated. By the end of it, so it's sort of like this roller coaster thing. They're sort of down. They're like, this will never amount to anything. What are these nuts teaching us? And then they're up. They're like, oh my gosh, if-then statements can solve absolutely everything.
Right.
And then they're back down again. They're like, oh my gosh, this is really freaking hard. And after they come back down again on wow, this problem is really hard, then it's sort of like they've had a little bit of enlightenment and they see everything and they now understand the realistic. Oh, this is computationally expensive. This is going to be difficult. We can't account for all these things. And one thing, the project that came up in is taking the language of statutes, taking the language of police complaints, and then trying to, given a police complaint, what crime was committed. Okay. And so we gave the students a really naive way to start it. Well, maybe you could think of just keywords, with just, a bag of words approach. Start looking for shared words across documents. If there's a high match, then, output, that crime or whatever. And then one of the students, who was one of the best that we've had, he came to me and he was like, I'm not going to solve this with just bag of words, am I? And I said, no, you absolutely are not. And we started to have a deeper conversation. And for me, my PhD research is all NLP. And I start to really have this conversation about the intricacies of natural language processing, language model, how we model language, why it's 10 times harder in the legal domain. And he really had that moment where you could tell, if he were to go out and pursue this or do something forward, he would be competent to handle what's in front of him because he would know the challenges involved, at least be able to think through it, understand problems that he was encountered with. And so I think on top of the analytical power, as lawyers, they know the precision that they have to get in front of a judge or a jury. And so they're able to translate that and see well, that script that I just write might not even get, 10% of the way there.
And he went on to take our statistics and machine learning class in the law school, but he also took a class on data structures and algorithms in the computer science department. So what we really are starting to see is that folks are opening up to the idea of now going back and further developing these skills. And we've had some conversations with folks like Bloomberg Law about hiring our students as software developers in the law, because if they can get through data structures and algorithms, we can teach them the rest of what they need to know. And this combined skill set is something that we haven't found people who have.
I'm really excited for you with also that NLP you were saying earlier that you're going to be adding some more in a second course.
Yeah.
And you're going to do legal analysis or research. and all these other like
Yeah.
automating, or you're like,
I would say that machine learning and natural language processing, after I learned Python, they became near and dear to my heart. And I absolutely love and adore those areas of study and those fields of discipline. And when I got into NLP at first, I would see there are all these models out there that can handle all these amazing tasks, and like maybe dealing with like news or, summarizing news stories, I think was popular back then or something like that. That could do all these things. But then you read any of the literature on how these sorts of things go in law, and it's like, the plane lost both engines midair and it's heading down. And so I became, really passionate about, how do you even go about taking tools that exist in natural language processing, and how can you do anything even remotely useful in the legal domain? I mean, even basic classification is hard. And so what I'm going to do is take them through like the very bare bones basic of natural language processing to understand what goes behind it, why we're thinking that way, why we do these certain things. And then along the way, pull in, relevant literature from, okay, well, let's take something super simple. Like, here's a bag of words, vectorization, representation of words. Okay. And here's how somebody tried that, maybe 15 years ago. And here's how it massively failed. And here's why. And go through in the legal domain where it becomes challenging. And I think I hope it'll be sobering for them as lawyers to realize, if they're confronted with AI tools based in NLP, like why you totally cannot trust whatever comes out of there. Even if it's a well-built system, you should know what's going on behind the scenes. And I hope they'll be able to interface with that. And I'm going to do, the class is going to be structured that somebody who hasn't gone through coding will be able to come and listen to lecture and sort of pick up what they're dealing with. And then I'm doing another part of the class for students who've had coding, and that's where we're going to have the fun and take legal documents and corpus and break it down, do some cool things with it. I think that by the end of it, I'll have them assemble and fine tune their own transformer model, like BERT or something like that, and put it to a task.
Have you heard of Ines Montani? She was on our show. You need to you check her out. She's the CEO of Explosion and Spacey. She's NLP, and that's what I was thinking of about it, because Prodigy or something. She made that. Sean, you can explain it. She made some sort of annotation tool that kind of helps.
I don't think she's looking specifically at the law space, but I bet you'd have a really fascinating conversation with her. And be able to dig into some really interesting applications of both what you're doing and what she's working on. So
she's a linguist.
Oh, great. Yeah. It's amazing how many folks are linguists.
Well, I wanted to kind of wrap us up a little bit in terms and talk a little bit about the future. You mentioned that you've been speaking with Bloomberg Law, and they're very interested in finding this blending of skill sets between software development and law students. Are you seeing a lot of demand from employers of different kinds, whether that's law firms or, like public defenders' offices, or, the typical sources of, jobs for law school graduates? Are they seeing the value in this? Are they asking for people with these kinds of skills, or do they even know that this is possible yet?
The latter. Yeah. And that was what was so fascinating. Like, the Bloomberg people didn't know we were out there, and lawyers don't, because I think there are 7 different schools that are teaching some form of Python, law schools. Now 8, the University of Washington. No, they're not. They're doing R at the University of Washington. So there are 7 that are teaching some form of Python. The numbers are just really, really small. And what's fascinating to me is that sort of the legal tech people don't even recognize the need to find lawyers who have this hybrid skill. The people who are actually building this stuff. We've talked to a few companies that are like, oh yeah, no, lawyers aren't at the level where they could do this. I'm like, well, maybe you ought to talk to us a little more and see what we can actually do. But so like Bloomberg expressed a real interest, and there's a firm in London, or London-based firm, and they actually have a legal tech research and development department. And so we hope to start to placing a couple of students as summer associates with that London-based firm. Reed Smith at one point had a tech summer associate program, but I think that's gone by the wayside. And I really kind of think that it's an issue of sort of timing. My wife worked for an investment banking firm on Wall Street that for years ago, and like about 20 years ago, her boss was really fascinated with electric cars and charging stations. There was an investor who wanted to make charging station for electric cars, and his business failed miserably because if there are no cars, your charging stations don't have any real point. I'm wondering whether we're at the point where we have enough cars and enough electric charging stations, enough law students who can do the hybrid, and enough folks out there who recognize and can use these hybrid folks. So, Bloomberg's one of our start. This London firm is another possibility. We've got to start to. I mean, we've all got to find each other, and that's going to be the real trick.
Yeah, it feels like it's like a super cooled liquid. All it's going to take is one hard shake, and it's all going to crystallize much faster than any of us expect.
Exactly.
I have a totally off topic, you know me. So PyCon's very unique experience. I don't know if this was your first PyCon this year.
It was.
So I wanted to ask you, as lawyers, because I remember my first PyCon as a non-coder, really. How did you share your experience, and what did you think about being with a bunch of nerdy people like Sean?
So my initial reaction was, and of course, this is coming from bias towards education and academics, is like, why wasn't everybody who had a stake in some company or something like that there listening to what's going on at the education summit? I would have, if I was in charge, everybody, there would have been mandatory attendance, and we all would have came and sat and listened to the education summit, because a lot of times I find, like, especially in research, something really cool will come out of the lab, and then industry has absolutely no use for it. Okay. Or industry really needs something. Nobody in research cares. Like, and I just guess, like, I was thinking, like, wow, even here, there's a divide. But I would say the first thing that I noticed is everybody at the education summit was just like 10 out of 10 jazzed about Python. And it was like it was a really invigorating environment. It was cool to nerd out with somebody about something other than, something legal.
And I was amazed at how interested people were in what we were doing, because we come at this from a totally different angle. You had a lot of folks like Kelly who were teaching in secondary schools who were there. And here we are, graduate schools, completely unrelated to computer science. And I went back the second day, and with the masks, I figure, like, it's kind of hard to identify people. A couple people came up to me just to talk about my talk the previous day. So I was actually really fascinated with how many people were interested in what we had to say.
I'll tell you why, at least for me. We sit there in 8th grade and 9th grade and 10th grade and 11th grade. They're like, why do I have to take this course? And I'm like, everybody needs to learn how to code. I'm not going to need to learn how to code. I'm going to be a lawyer. And now I'm like, yeah, right. So I think as K-12 teachers, we try to predict to these kids of what's going to happen in law school, and a lot of degrees now are requiring at least some sort of computer science. So I think for at least people like me, being able to say, oh yeah, you don't think you need coding? This is how it's going to help you. So I think that's like a rewarding thing for us to see that you are passionate about it as professors of law in a university, and that you're coming in and saying, hey, look, coding is great for the brain. It is going to be useful for your job. And here's why. So kudos to you guys for that. And thank you for coming to Education Summit, because
Absolutely.
it's great.
Well, I have my off-topic question is for anyone who's thinking about coming next year, because PyCon will again be in Pittsburgh, because we go,
Really?
2 years in a row.
Mhm.
Oh yeah, the PyCon pattern is to stay in the same city for 2 years, because by the time you make all the connections and you organize everything, it makes sense to use that investment over 2 years. So, um, I spent most of the PyCon with my friends from all over the world, showing them how Duquesne is not pronounced the way it's spelled, right? Based on my uh, based on my experience as a long ago CMU student. So I wanted to know, for people who are coming back next year to Pittsburgh, what's one thing from each of you that you would recommend they check out in Pittsburgh that's one of your favorite things that maybe is not downtown or not in the convention center?
Yeah.
It's not downtown.
So if you're a fan of architecture, I think Pittsburgh has some of the most gorgeous houses of worship of any city in the country. Boston might rival it, London, yeah, but beyond those two, so like there's a temple right across the street from the Mr. Rogers studio, and then there are just multiple massive churches, and then like and outside of that, like just architecture generally. Downtown there is what's that, the Union, is it the Union Trust?
Union Trust,
The
yeah.
Union Trust building. So I think that there's some architecture in this city. I think churches are the kind of the standout for the architecture in the city. But then even within the downtown, the Union Trust building is really worth, like from the outside looking at, kind of get a step back. And there are kind of these two little like apartment houses things on the top of the skyscraper. And then when you go in it, there's just this wonderful it's kind of pre-Art Deco, kind of almost Gilded Age style skyscraper. So I would say, various aspects of our architecture.
Yeah. Kind of going off, maybe not exactly off of that. I would say, like, if anybody there's also interested in history, Pittsburgh's been around for like a really, really long time, and most people don't really like recognize that. And so I would say, anybody, especially who's really interested in Revolutionary history, there are some interesting sites around the city. There's a well-preserved fort, maybe an hour drive from the city, if somebody wanted to do that. Anybody who has it specifically like Revolutionary history would be at least moderately well served in Pittsburgh.
And a Pirates game. Because if you want, not so much because of the team, but because like it's one of the prettiest parks in the country. Not particularly historic itself, but you get this wonderful view across the river of downtown, and it almost looks like it's not really real. It's a very neat experience.
Yeah, Sean took us there when we did our course at CMU for robotics. That I agree. That was a good view. That was fun.
And you can still, if I remember correctly, they still have a marker in Oakland for the original Pittsburgh ball field before Three Rivers, where you can see
Forbes Field,
yeah. And so like there's just a ton of those little hidden gems around Pittsburgh where you can go and see something cool and see something historic. And I went to the Heinz History Museum for the first time while I was in Pittsburgh this last for PyCon, and really just enjoyed kind of like walking through all the different exhibits. And they have a bunch of things that are just like, here's our archives on display. We have to store them somewhere, so we're going to put them in a glass case so you can at least look at them while they're in storage. And it's really cool to be able to see all of that. They had like of all things, they had one of the 2 Tommy guns that the Pittsburgh Police Department bought back in the 1920s to fight during Prohibition and during the 30s. So just random things that are cool, and that's one of the things I love the most about Pittsburgh is just there's a lot of history there and a lot of cool things to go see.
And the Natural History Museum. I wandered into there one day. It's phenomenal. I mean, I think that's got to be one of the largest dinosaur bone collections I've ever seen in one place.
Very cool. Well, hopefully I get to go back next year. I'm going to put that in early, and hopefully you guys get to come back and join us.
Absolutely.
All right.
Cool.
Well, I think we're already at time or overtime, so I'm going to wrap us up here by saying thank you to Wes and Morgan for joining us. Thanks for sharing more about the work that you're doing at Duquesne and the School of Law. And if people want to find out more about the programs of the Duquesne University School of Law, specifically around the Coding for Lawyers course, we will put links to that in the show notes so you can refer to that and get in touch with Wes and Morgan to learn more.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. If somebody's interested in implementing something similar, we're always very willing to help.
Yeah, and I definitely think it would be pretty cool if you got your first incoming law student who came because there was coding for lawyers in the program. I think that'd be a pretty great win also.
It would be.
It would.
Very cool.
All right.
All right. Well, so for teaching
Thanks.
Python.
Thanks.
Oh, thanks guys. So for teaching Python, this is Sean.
And this is Kelly signing off.